There is a deeply ingrained idea in our culture that life improves when we understand more, control more, do more. But what if the opposite were true? What if much of human suffering doesn't come from a lack of awareness, but from an excess of inner interference? Maybe the problem isn't that you haven't arrived yet. Maybe it's that you never stepped out of the way. Most people aren't lost because they're missing something essential, but because they're carrying too much. Memories, guilt, expectations, identities, relentless attempts to fix themselves. We live as if life were a problem to be solved, when in fact it may simply be asking for space to happen. And that request is almost never comfortable for the ego. Zero Limits is not a book for those seeking more techniques, more personal power, or more spiritual control. It is a dangerous book for anyone who still believes that consciousness evolves through accumulation. Here, transformation doesn't come through effort, it comes through emptying. It doesn't come through conquest, it comes through surrender. In this video we won't explain the book. We won't summarize it. We won't turn it into a method. We will move through it the way one moves through a symbolic portal. We'll use it as a mirror of the modern human condition. Tired, fragmented, saturated, yet still profoundly alive. If you feel that you've tried everything to change and something still feels heavy, maybe this content isn't here to teach you something new. Maybe it's here to help you let go of what never needed to be carried in the first place. And sometimes, that is the deepest form of awakening. The invisible discomfort. When life works but the soul doesn't rest. There is a kind of unease that makes no noise. It doesn't scream, it doesn't interrupt routines, it doesn't stop life from moving forward. On the contrary, it often shows up precisely when everything seems to be working. The job is fine, bills are paid, relationships are stable, and yet, inside, something doesn't settle. It's as if the soul is always a few seconds behind the body, trying to catch up to a rhythm that isn't its own. I speak of this invisible discomfort because it is the silent starting point of Zero Limits, even though the book never names it that way. This discomfort is rarely interpreted as an inner call. More often, it's treated as something to be fixed externally. Better organization, higher productivity, stronger emotional control, more applied spirituality. We try to fix the feeling by adjusting the surface of life. We change habits, environments, people, goals. But the unease persists because it doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from how we're inhabiting ourselves. It's a fatigue that doesn't come from physical effort, but from the constant tension of maintaining an identity. When I read Zero Limits, I don't just see a spiritual proposal. I see an uncomfortable mirror held up to an entire culture that believes consciousness is something to be acquired, rather than something to be cleared. The book begins where almost no one wants to begin, with the recognition that we are saturated. Saturated with inner stories, emotional memories, automatic reactions, and attempts at control. And that saturation creates noise, a constant noise that blocks inner silence. And without silence, the soul cannot rest. You might recognize this in small, everyday moments. You wake up already tired, not from the day ahead, but from a thought that never stopped. You talk to someone, but part of you is always defending, explaining, justifying yourself internally. You even relax, but you never truly feel at home inside yourself. This state isn't pathological, it's common. But being common doesn't make it natural. It points to a consciousness that lives outward, even when it believes it's being introspective. The invisible discomfort is the first symptom of a deeper disconnection, the loss of contact with the point of origin. Not with some elevated spiritual concept, but with that inner place that exists before reaction, before memory, before the self that tries. Zero Limits gestures toward this indirectly, almost unsettlingly, by suggesting that the problem is never really out there. When heard superficially, this sounds like blame. But when felt deeply, it reveals something else, an opportunity to return. There is a subtle, and crucial, difference between taking responsibility and carrying weight. Invisible discomfort arises when we confuse the two. We carry the emotional world on our backs, trying to solve it, manage it, understand it rationally. Taking responsibility, in the deeper sense suggested by the book, isn't about doing more. It's about noticing where we're interfering too much, where we're trying to live from layers that should have been passed through, not sustained. This silent unease also shows up as a sense of existential delay, as if life is happening in real time, but our awareness is always reacting to something that has already passed. That's memory at work, not just factual memory but emotional, symbolic, unconscious memory. Zero Limits doesn't begin by proposing cleaning as a technique. It begins by exposing a condition, a consciousness that isn't empty enough to listen. And here a paradox emerges. The more we try to understand this discomfort intellectually, the stronger it becomes. Because it doesn't ask for analysis, it asks for space. It doesn't want to be solved, it wants to be recognized. Recognized not as a personal failure, but as a sign that something essential is being smothered by excess identity. The soul does not rest where there is constant effort to be someone. At this point, you may be expecting practical guidance, something to do right away. But this first movement isn't active, it's perceptual. It's noticing where you live in unnecessary tension, where you respond before listening, where you try to improve life without first quieting the noise that distorts it. This recognition doesn't bring immediate relief, but it brings honesty. And honesty is always the beginning of any real process of integration. Zero limits begins symbolically in this uncomfortable place. Not by offering answers, but by dismantling the illusion that we already know where the problem lies. Before speaking of cleaning, forgiveness, or love, the book places us before a silent question. What if the exhaustion you feel isn't from life itself, but from the way you're carrying it inside? That question doesn't get answered yet. It simply opens the next door. Memory, pain, and the unconscious, the invisible weight we don't know we're carrying. When we talk about memory, we usually think of clear recollections, past events, defining moments, episodes we can narrate. But there is another kind of memory, far subtler and more powerful, that doesn't show up as image or story but as reaction. It appears in the body before it reaches the mind. It shows up as irritation without an obvious cause, disproportionate fear, sudden fatigue, emotional shutdown in seemingly simple situations. Zero limits points directly to this invisible territory, where pain isn't remembered, it's repeated. I like to think of this deeper memory as a field. Not an archive but an inner climate. You enter certain situations and, without noticing, the climate shifts. The body tightens, the breath shortens, the mind accelerates. Nothing objectively threatening has happened, but something has been activated. This is the unconscious in action, not as a distant psychological concept, but as a living force that organizes how we perceive, interpret, and respond to the world. Joe Vitale's work touches this point when it suggests that we carry programs running in the background, even when we believe we're fully aware. The invisible weight of unconscious memory doesn't always show up as explicit pain. Often, it expresses itself as excessive effort. The need to control everything, to anticipate problems, to protect ourselves emotionally. We live as if something is always about to go wrong. And paradoxically, this inner state creates exactly the kind of reality we're trying to avoid, not through naive mysticism but through psychological coherence. The world we perceive tends to confirm the state of consciousness from which we're looking. In Zero Limits, the idea that everything is memory may sound extreme. But when engaged deeply, it reveals a disturbing invitation to observe how many of our choices don't arise from the present, but from old layers that were never integrated. How many decisions are made to avoid feeling something ancient? How many relationships are shaped by wounds we no longer recognize as wounds? The unconscious doesn't need to be remembered in order to act. It only needs to remain unseen. There's a delicate point here and it deserves care. Acknowledging the role of unconscious memory doesn't mean denying objective reality, nor abandoning practical responsibility. It means realizing that we respond to the world through inherited emotional lenses, from personal, family, cultural, and even collective experiences. Zero Limits expands this field by suggesting that pain doesn't belong only to the isolated individual, but to a larger flow of shared consciousness. Regardless of how literally one takes this, the psychological effect is clear. We're carrying more than we think is ours. You may have noticed this when emotions arise that are disproportionate to the current event. A small critique triggers an intense reaction. Someone's silence evokes abandonment. A simple mistake activates deep shame. In those moments, it's not the present that hurts, it's the memory that's been touched. And the more we try to solve this rationally, the more the pain defends itself, because it doesn't want to be explained, it wants to be released. The great modern misunderstanding is believing that consciousness is synonymous with understanding. But many forms of pain don't ask for understanding, they ask for dissolution. Zero Limits proposes something radical here. Instead of revisiting the story, clean the field. Instead of interpreting trauma, deactivate the charge. This doesn't replace therapeutic processes, but it reveals another level of inner work. One that doesn't engage with narrative, but with the energetic and emotional root of experience. There is also an implicit relief in this view. If much of what we carry is unconscious, then we're not as flawed as we imagine. We're not morally failing for feeling what we feel. We're reacting to contents that were never invited to leave. Unconscious pain persists not because it's too strong, but because it's ignored or fought. And whatever is fought internally grows stronger. As we recognize this invisible weight, something begins to shift, not immediately in emotion but in inner posture. Life stops feeling like a constant battlefield against unwanted reactions and becomes a space for more honest observation. You begin to notice that you are not the anger, the fear, or the sadness. You are the field in which these memories appear. This shift in identity is subtle but fundamental. And it's precisely here that zero limits begins to point beyond traditional psychology. Because if pain isn't only personal, if memory isn't only individual, then inner work can't be just personal effort. Something in us has to step out of the center of control for cleaning to occur. But that stepping out doesn't happen all at once. It requires the prior exhaustion of the old model, the model of the self that fixes everything. And it's this specific kind of fatigue that prepares the ground for the next movement. Without realizing it, as we acknowledge the invisible weight we carry, we touch a deeper question. What if the problem isn't what we feel but the identity from which we're trying to deal with it? That question doesn't get answered yet. It simply nudges us slowly toward the next threshold of the journey. The saturated self, when identity, control, and effort become spiritual obstacles. There comes a point on the inner path when the problem is no longer the pain itself, but the way we try to deal with it. After recognizing the weight of memory and the unconscious, something becomes clear. We're tired not only of what we feel but of the constant effort of managing who we are. This is where what I call the saturated self emerges. A self overloaded with roles, strategies, narratives, and attempts at control. A self that can't rest because it believes that if it lets go, everything will collapse. This saturated self isn't a villain. It was born as a survival mechanism. At some point in life it was necessary. We learned to control emotions to be accepted, to shape behavior to avoid rejection, to create versions of ourselves that could function in the world. The problem isn't the construction of this identity, but its persistence beyond its time. We keep living as if we're always in danger, even when the context has changed. And this constant state of alert consumes an immense amount of psychic and spiritual energy. When Zero Limits speaks of total responsibility, many people interpret it as doing more. More vigilance, more self-correction, more inner discipline. But read deeply, the book points in the opposite direction. The exhaustion of the doer model. The saturated self believes everything depends on it. Its emotions, its outcomes, its spiritual growth, even its healing. And this belief, though it sounds mature, is profoundly exhausting. It creates a paradox. The more we try to become conscious, the more rigid we become. You may recognize this in your own pursuit of self-knowledge. Constant reading, continuous practice, relentless self-observation. All of this can be valuable until it turns into inner surveillance. A state in which we're never truly present because we're always watching ourselves. The saturated self turns consciousness into a task. And when that happens, spirituality loses its lightness and becomes another arena of silent self-pressure. A specific kind of fatigue emerges here. It's not the fatigue of someone who failed repeatedly, but of someone who tried too hard. Tried to be better, more aware, more loving, more balanced. Tried to understand themselves to the point of exhaustion. This fatigue is important because it signals that the identity we're using to evolve no longer works. Zero Limits touches this point almost disconcertingly by suggesting that cleaning doesn't happen through the effort of the self, but through its surrender. Surrender here doesn't mean giving up on life or abandoning practical responsibility. It's the collapse of an illusion, the belief that the separate self can solve what was created from separation. The saturated self tries to heal itself with the same tools that made it sick: control, overanalysis, anticipation, effort. And the more it tries, the further it moves from the inner space where healing happens without interference. Notice how this shows up in daily life. The difficulty of relaxing without guilt. The feeling that if you're not doing something productive, even spiritually, you're wasting time. The inability to simply be without improving, fixing, or understanding. These are all signs of an identity that has lost contact with silence. And without silence, there is no space for something new to emerge. The saturated self also reveals itself in how we relate to others. We want to fix, explain, guide, protect. Even when we love, we try to control outcomes. This pattern doesn't come from malice, but from fear of losing inner ground. When identity is overloaded, it needs external stability to feel safe. And that creates tension in relationships, in the body, in the mind. Zero Limits begins to suggest, still indirectly, that there is an intelligence operating beyond personal effort. An intelligence that doesn't respond to control but to availability. However, as long as the saturated self remains in charge, this intelligence has no space to act. Not because it's absent, but because it's drowned out by excess intention. Perhaps the hardest movement here is admitting that we don't know how to let go. That we try to relax and can't. That we try to trust but something in us remains tense. And that's okay. This recognition isn't failure, it's maturity. It signals that we've reached the limit of what the self can do for itself. And that limit, paradoxically, isn't an end, it's a threshold. Without yet announcing what comes next, zero limits leads us to a quiet, almost uncomfortable question. What happens when the self that tries gets tired of trying? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply weakens, little by little, the identity that always wanted to be in control, preparing the ground for something that doesn't arise from effort, but from emptying. Zero limits as psychological death, the necessary collapse of the inner doer. There is a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, when inner effort stops making sense. Not because life is resolved, but because something in us realizes that continuing in the same way is pointless. This moment is rarely celebrated. It doesn't come with clarity or immediate relief. It comes as a deep exhaustion of the inner doer. Zero limits, when approached honestly, points precisely to this threshold, not as a spiritual technique, but as a necessary psychological death. Calling it death may sound dramatic, but there is no more accurate word. What dies here isn't the person, nor practical responsibility, nor the ability to act in the world. What collapses is the identity that believes it is the source of solutions. The self that does, the self that controls, the self that understands begins to lose authority. And this loss doesn't happen because we consciously choose it, but because this identity can no longer sustain the weight it carries. This psychological death is deeply counterintuitive. We were taught that maturity means more control, more clarity, more inner mastery. But zero limits suggests a different kind of maturity, one that emerges when we recognize the real limits of the functional ego. Not as criticism but as fact. The ego was never meant to carry the entire field of life. It was designed to operate in the world, not to govern the totality of consciousness. As the doer begins to collapse, a subtle fear arises, a fear of emptiness, of losing inner reference points. Many people mistake this state for apathy, depression, or giving up. But at its core, it's something else. The withdrawal of psychic investment from an identity that no longer delivers what it promised. Effort stops producing meaning. Seeking stops producing expansion. And this isn't regression, it's transition. Notice how this collapse appears in everyday life. You still do what needs to be done, but without the same belief that it defines who you are. Automatic responses begin to fail. Old emotional strategies lose effectiveness. Control no longer soothes. Analysis no longer resolves. And for the first time you may feel truly groundless. This groundlessness isn't the absence of foundation, it's the absence of illusion. Zero limits calls this state zero, but not in the sense of sterile emptiness. Zero here precedes form. It's the point before reaction, before memory, before narrative. The psychological death of the doer doesn't take us to nothingness, it takes us to the space where something larger can operate. But this only happens if we resist the temptation to quickly fill the void with new techniques, new concepts, new spiritual identities. This is one of the most delicate moments of the inner journey, because the spiritual ego tries to reorganize itself. It may take the form of the one who does nothing, the one who trusts, the one who surrendered. But as long as there is a self-claiming authorship of the process, the collapse remains incomplete. Psychological death doesn't tolerate interested witnesses. It happens when we stop narrating ourselves as protagonists of our own emptying. There is often a strange sense of guilt at this stage, as if we were being irresponsible for no longer trying. As if letting go of control were a moral failure. This guilt reveals how deeply we've been conditioned to associate personal worth with constant effort. Zero limits confronts this belief by suggesting that true transformation doesn't arise from trying, but from allowing. And allowing isn't passive, it's profoundly active at a level the ego can't comprehend. You may notice that language starts to fail here. Because we're speaking of a state that doesn't rest on concepts. It's lived as silence, suspension, and extended pause. The mind tries to name it but can't. And that too is part of the process. The psychological death of the doer is also the death of the need to explain everything to ourselves. This collapse doesn't happen all at once. It comes in waves. Some days the self returns in full force. On others, it dissolves for brief moments. Zero limits doesn't romanticize this process, but points to it as inevitable for those who cross the threshold of effort. Because there is no deep cleaning while the doer remains in charge. There is no inner reorganization while we insist on being the center of the operation. Without yet announcing what emerges after this symbolic death, what remains is a silent opening. If the self that does isn't the one who transforms, then what acts when it falls silent? That question doesn't seek an intellectual answer. It simply prepares the inner space for something that only reveals itself when control no longer governs, and it is precisely toward that territory that the next movement leads us. Forgiveness without an object. The release that happens before understanding. When the inner doer begins to quiet down, something unexpected happens. The need to assign blame starts to lose its grip. Not because everything has been understood, nor because the pain has disappeared, but because the structure that sustained resentment begins to fall apart. It is in this strange space, where there is no longer full control and no sufficient explanation, that zero limits introduces one of its most unsettling ideas, a forgiveness that doesn't require an object. We're used to thinking of forgiveness as a directed act. Someone did something, someone forgives. There's a narrative, an event, a justification. But the forgiveness the book points to doesn't operate at that level. It isn't aimed at a specific person, nor does it require revisiting or reinterpreting the story. It is a release that happens even before we fully understand what needs to be forgiven. And this deeply challenges our emotional logic. This forgiveness without an object isn't a lofty moral act, nor a conscious effort to be kind. It emerges when we realize that much of the pain we carry no longer has a clear address. It doesn't belong only to the other nor only to us. It exists in the field, in memory, in repetition. When we try to forgive someone, we're often just rearranging the narrative so we can continue living inside it. The forgiveness of zero limits doesn't reorganize the story, it dissolves it. In everyday life, this shows up in very simple and yet profound ways. You notice yourself reacting less. Not because you've become indifferent, but because something inside you no longer has anywhere to latch on. That old anger doesn't sustain itself. Hurt may still arise, but it doesn't take root. There's no conscious effort to be better. There's simply less inner resistance. And where there is less resistance, energy stops accumulating in the form of pain. It's important to be very clear here. This kind of forgiveness does not erase boundaries. It does not eliminate practical responsibility. It does not turn abusive relationships into acceptable ones. Forgiveness without an object doesn't operate at the level of external decisions. It operates at the level of internal charge. You can step away from someone and still release the weight that person occupied inside you. This distinction is essential so spirituality isn't confused with emotional submission. Zero Limits proposes simple phrases, almost childlike at first glance. But when seen symbolically, these phrases function as switches that deactivate active memory. They don't explain, they clean. They don't ask you to understand the past, but to stop feeding it energetically in the present. And this only works when the doer is tired enough not to try to control the outcome. You may have experienced something like this already without naming it. A day when an old memory surfaces and, surprisingly, it doesn't hurt the same way. There was no analysis, no catharsis, no conscious resolution. There simply wasn't any charge. That is forgiveness happening before understanding. It doesn't pass through comprehension, it passes through the cessation of identification. There is also something profoundly liberating about this kind of forgiveness. It doesn't require reconciliation with the past narrative. You don't have to agree with what happened. You don't have to justify what was unjustifiable. You don't have to find meaning in the suffering. Forgiveness without an object doesn't make peace with the story, it steps out of it. And in stepping out, something inside you loosens. On a psychological level, this represents a radical shift in inner position. You stop being the wounded character trying to heal and become the space where the wound can no longer find support. The pain isn't denied, but it's no longer central. And when it stops being central, it begins to dissolve from lack of reactive attention. Zero Limits points to this movement quietly, almost in silence. This kind of forgiveness also changes how you relate to yourself. Self-criticism loses intensity. Old guilt begins to unravel. Not because you rationally absolved yourself, but because the field in which that guilt operated is no longer active. You stop punishing yourself for not having been different in the past, because you recognize that you were acting from a level of consciousness that is no longer current. None of this happens as a dramatic event. There's no specific moment when you say, "Now I've forgiven." There's simply a later realization. Something that used to hurt no longer weighs the same. Something that once defined your reactions now barely registers. That is the most reliable sign of real release. when it happens without needing to be announced. Without closing this movement yet, one important inner shift remains. If forgiveness isn't something we do but something that happens when control steps back, then what exactly is operating this release? That question begins to point toward an even subtler dimension of experience. One where love stops being an emotion and becomes a state of consciousness. Love as a state of consciousness, not an emotion. There comes a moment on the inner journey when the word love begins to lose its usual associations. It no longer points primarily to feeling, bonding, exchange, or directed affection. Not because those experiences disappear, but because something more fundamental begins to be perceived behind them. Zero Limits touches this point subtly, almost without defining it, by suggesting that love isn't something we do, but something that happens when consciousness stops defending itself. We are deeply conditioned to understand love as an emotion, something that arises, grows, fades, disappears. Something that depends on the other, on context, on shared history. But emotions are movements, they come and go. The love the book points to doesn't move, it holds. It doesn't react, it allows. It is a state of consciousness that doesn't need to show up as intense feeling in order to be present. It's recognized more easily by the absence of inner war than by the presence of euphoria. In daily life, this love shows up almost invisibly. It appears as spontaneous patience, as listening without preparing a response, as the ability to stay with discomfort without needing to fix it. You don't feel love all the time, but you notice that you react less from fear. And where fear loses ground, love doesn't need to announce itself. It's already there as the background. This loving state of consciousness doesn't depend on spiritual merit. It doesn't arise because you've become better, more evolved, or more virtuous. It arises because the defensive identity has weakened. When the saturated self dissolves, when forgiveness without an object releases charge, the inner field becomes less tense. And that deep relaxation is, in itself, a form of love. Not romantic, not emotional, but ontological. Zero Limits suggests that love is what remains when memories are cleaned. Not as an ideal but as the natural state of consciousness without noise. This completely inverts the usual logic. We don't seek love as something to attain, we remove the obstacles that conceal it. Love isn't constructed, it's revealed. And the main obstacle isn't a lack of virtue, but an excess of defense. You may notice this in simple relationships. A moment when someone makes a mistake and you don't feel the need to correct them. A shared silence that doesn't feel awkward. A boundary set without aggression. All of these are expressions of this quiet love. It doesn't show up as blind surrender, but as clarity without rigidity. It isn't confused with attachment, because it doesn't arise from the need to complete something missing. There is also a deep shift in how you relate to yourself. The inner voice loses its harshness. Mistakes stop feeling like threats to identity. The past no longer demands constant repair. This love doesn't say, everything is fine in a superficial way, it simply doesn't turn everything into a problem. And when something isn't experienced as a problem, it resolves with far less suffering. Psychologically, this state corresponds to an integration that doesn't come from control. You don't need to monitor your thoughts to be loving. You don't need to regulate your emotions to deserve peace. Love as a state of consciousness doesn't depend on inner performance. It depends on giving up the fight with what is. And that isn't resignation, it's alignment. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this love is that it offers no identity. You can't claim to be loving because of it. You can't appropriate it as a personal quality. It happens when you're not trying to be someone. That's why it's so hard to sustain under constant self-observation. The moment the ego tries to take ownership, it contracts. Love here remains only where there is no possession. Zero Limits points to this state without describing it directly, because it doesn't rest on definitions. It's lived as a kind of benevolent neutrality. An inner yes to experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable. Not a naive yes but an unarmed one. And that disarmament changes how life responds, not by magic but by coherence of field. Without closing this movement yet, a new inner shift emerges. If love isn't something we feel but something we are when we stop resisting, then what begins to act in the world from this state? That question leads us into a territory where action and silence are no longer opposites, and it's exactly there that the next chapter opens. The intelligence that acts in silence, letting go, synchronicity, and alignment. When love stops being an emotion and becomes a state of consciousness, something curious begins to happen. Life seems to respond differently. Not in spectacular or mystical ways, but with quiet precision. Situations reorganize themselves. Conflicts lose intensity. Decisions arise with less hesitation. Zero limits points to this phenomenon as a natural result of letting go, not as a spiritual reward, but as the consequence of deeper inner alignment. The intelligence that begins to operate here doesn't show up as a clear voice or explicit guidance. It acts in silence, in the gaps between thoughts, in choices that seem obvious only after they're made. There's no heroic effort, no sense of expanded control. Quite the opposite. The more this intelligence operates, the less the self feels the need to interfere. And that can be unsettling because we've been taught to associate conscious action with deliberate effort. In everyday life, this translates into small synchronicities. A meeting that happens at the right moment. A conversation that resolves something old without planning. A difficult decision that suddenly feels simple. Not because you've become smarter, but because inner noise has decreased. And when noise decreases, perception sharpens. You see what was previously obscured by the anxiety of deciding. It's important not to romanticize this process. The intelligence that acts in silence doesn't eliminate challenges or guarantee constant comfort. What it does is reduce inner friction with what needs to be lived. You still face limits, losses, difficult choices, but without the sense of fighting life itself. Zero limits suggests that when memory is cleaned, action arises from the real present, not from the repetition of the past. This letting go isn't irresponsibility. It doesn't mean passively letting life decide everything. It's a different kind of cooperation with reality. You act when action is clear. You wait when it isn't. And that waiting isn't paralysis, it's listening. Most human errors are born from action taken to relieve anxiety, not to respond to what is actually calling for movement. You may notice this in simple decisions. Before, there was intense inner debate. Now there's quiet clarity. Not absolute certainty, but the absence of conflict. You don't need to convince yourself. The body agrees. The mind follows. This inner agreement is a sign of alignment. It's not a guarantee of external success, but it is a guarantee of internal integrity. Zero limits says little about direct action, but it says a great deal about the state from which action arises. And that's the crucial point. When action comes from silence, it carries less projection, less expectation, less fear. It doesn't need to prove anything. And for that reason, it's often more effective, not because it controls outcomes, but because it doesn't oppose the natural flow of the situation. Synchronicities in this context aren't isolated magical events. They're signs that you're no longer moving through reality in constant friction. They indicate that your inner posture is coherent with life's movement. When there is coherence, reality responds with less resistance. That doesn't mean the absence of limits, but the presence of dialogue. There's also a shift in the relationship with time. Urgency diminishes. The impulse to resolve everything immediately loses strength. You begin to notice that many things resolve themselves when they aren't pushed. And that requires trust. Not blind trust, but trust grounded in direct experience. The experience that when excessive control is released, something sustains the process. This is one of the great paradoxes of zero limits. The less you try to direct life from the ego, the more precise you become in the interventions that are actually necessary. Action stops being reaction and becomes response. And response always arises from listening. This listening isn't passive, it's profoundly active because it requires full presence. Without closing this movement yet, a new silent question appears. If this intelligence operates when we don't interfere, how do we begin to see the world, conflicts, and relationships from this new state of consciousness? It's this shift in perception, from reality as a problem to reality as a mirror, that begins to unfold in the next chapter. The world as a living mirror, relationships, conflicts, and symptoms as messages. When silent intelligence begins to operate and excessive control recedes, something decisive changes in how we see the world. Reality stops being merely a set of external events independent of us and begins to be perceived as a living mirror. Not in the simplistic sense that everything is created by the mind, but as a symbolic field that responds to the quality of our presence. Zero limits touches this point by suggesting that what appears outside reveals something that still seeks integration within. This perspective completely transforms our relationship with conflict. Before, conflict was something to be defeated, avoided, or fixed. Now it presents itself as language, often uncomfortable language, but revealing nonetheless. This isn't about passively accepting everything or romanticizing suffering. It's about asking with honesty, what is this situation touching in me? Where is there still automatic reaction? Where is there still active memory asking to be released? Relationships are the most intense mirror in this process. People don't enter our lives randomly at the level of consciousness. They activate exactly the points where we're still identified. A simple comment triggers irritation. Silence evokes abandonment. Disagreement becomes a threat. These movements reveal inner layers that wouldn't be visible in isolation. Zero limits invites us to stop using relationships merely as stages for reaction and start seeing them as spaces of revelation. This doesn't mean the other person is right or that you should erase yourself. A mirror doesn't tell you who's correct. It shows you where there's charge. And charge isn't moral, it's energetic and emotional. When an external situation provokes a strong reaction, it's pointing to something that was already there, waiting for a trigger. The world doesn't create the wound, it illuminates it. The same principle applies to physical and emotional symptoms. The body often speaks before the mind. Chronic fatigue, persistent tension, recurring discomforts can be seen simply as problems to eliminate. But zero limits suggests a deeper reading, the symptom as a message. Not as punishment but as a signal of inner imbalance. When consciousness resists for too long, the body takes on the role of messenger. In daily life, this shift in perception brings a practical transformation. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "What is this revealing in me?" This simple inversion moves you from the position of victim to that of conscious observer. Not a cold observer but an honest one. Someone willing to listen to what experience is saying, even when the message is uncomfortable. It's important to emphasize, seeing the world as a mirror doesn't mean taking blame for everything. Guilt paralyzes, responsibility liberates. Guilt asks, "Where did I mess up?" Responsibility asks, "What is this showing me right now?" Zero limits operates at this subtler level, where consciousness takes in what appears without punishing itself for it. This is real spiritual maturity, not an idealized one. You begin to notice that many conflicts dissolve when they aren't fed internally. The other person remains who they are, but the charge diminishes. The external situation may even stay the same, but your experience of it changes radically. And often, when experience changes, the situation reorganizes as well, not through control but through resonance. There is also something deeply liberating in this way of seeing. It returns inner power without inflating the ego. You don't feel superior for understanding the mirror. You feel more available to learn from it. Life stops being an enemy to conquer and becomes an ongoing conversation. Sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, but always revealing. Zero limits doesn't suggest that we live trying to decode symbols all the time. That would just be another form of disguised control. The invitation is simpler. When something hits deeply, instead of reacting immediately, clean. Let go. Allow the charge to dissolve before turning the experience into a narrative. This gesture changes the relationship with the world quietly but profoundly. Without closing this movement yet, an important transition remains. If the world reflects the state of our consciousness, what is it like to live when that consciousness begins to be consistently purified, in real daily life with concrete decisions, boundaries, and choices? It's this post-inner war life, imperfect, human, yet lighter, that begins to reveal itself in the next chapter. Living without inner war, daily life after the purification of consciousness. There is a common fantasy in many spiritual paths. The idea that after a certain point of awareness, life will become light, fluid, and free of conflict. Zero limits, when approached with maturity, dismantles this illusion quietly. What changes is not the absence of challenges, but the end of inner war. And that difference is everything. Living without inner war is not living without pain, it is living without unnecessary resistance to pain when it appears. In daily life, this change is less visible than one might imagine. There is no special aura, no elevated discourse, no obvious spiritual posture. There is something much simpler, less internal friction. Decisions still exist, but they no longer carry the same existential weight. You choose, act, adjust, without excessive dramatization, without turning every mistake into an identity. Life stops being a permanent internal courtroom. One of the first signs of this purification of consciousness is a change in the relationship with error. Before, making a mistake meant failing as a person. Now, making a mistake means learning something about the moment. There is no artificial indulgence and no self-deception. There is responsibility without cruelty. Zero limits points to this state by suggesting that when memory is cleaned, the present no longer has to carry the weight of all possible pasts. Boundaries also change in nature. Before, they were imposed rigidly or avoided out of fear of conflict. Now they arise with clarity. You say no without aggressiveness. You say yes without abandoning yourself. This happens because the boundary no longer comes from defense, but from inner listening. When there is no war inside, there is no need to fight outside in order to protect yourself. In the emotional field, feelings still arise. Sadness, frustration, fear, none of that disappears. What disappears is prolonged identification. Emotion passes through the body, is felt, recognized, and then follows its course. It does not turn into a repeated story. It does not become an internal argument. This is one of the deepest effects of continuous cleaning. Emotion stops being a prison and returns to being movement. At work, in family life, and in close relationships, this translates into presence. You are no longer always trying to anticipate problems or control outcomes. You respond to what is in front of you now. This presence generates a sense of calm solidity. People notice, not because you speak differently but because you react differently. Less reactivity creates more space for real dialogue. There is also an important shift in the relationship with time. Anxiety decreases not because everything is resolved, but because you trust the process more. Not a naive trust, but a trust built from direct experience that forcing things does not improve them. Little by little, you learn that many things align when they are not pushed. And this brings a kind of rest that does not depend on external circumstances. Zero limits suggests that this purification is not a single event, but a cultivated state. Memory continues to arise. The unconscious continues to offer content. The difference is that you no longer build an identity around it. Cleaning stops being a desperate attempt to change life and becomes a natural gesture of care for the inner field, like keeping a house livable, not perfect. At this point, something very subtle happens. You stop using spirituality as an escape. You no longer need to withdraw from the world in order to feel at peace. Peace begins to accompany you in simple tasks, ordinary days, banal conversations. This does not make life extraordinary, it makes it whole. And wholeness is far rarer than ecstasy. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of living without inner war is this: you stop feeling separate from life. Events are no longer against you or in your favor. They simply are. And when something is not lived as attack or reward, the response becomes more lucid. Consciousness moves with less distortion. This state does not eliminate relapses. On some days the old war returns. Control reappears. The mind becomes agitated. But now you recognize it more quickly. You do not condemn yourself for it. You clean. You release. You return. This ability to return without guilt is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity. Zero limits, at its core, points to this profound simplicity. With that, the first 9 movements are completed, not as a closed conclusion but as preparation. Everything seen so far, discomfort, memory, ego, psychological death, forgiveness, love, alignment, mirror, and daily life, now asks for something different. Living integration. Not concept, not reflection alone, but concrete embodiment in a real life with real choices. The story of Raphael, when life stops being a problem and becomes a dialogue. I want to end this journey not with concepts but with a life. Because everything that has been said so far, discomfort, memory, ego, surrender, forgiveness, love, alignment, only becomes true when it touches the ground of everyday life. And it is on that ground that Raphael lives. Raphael is not a spiritual seeker, at least not in the classical sense. He does not meditate every day, does not quote books in conversation, does not define himself as someone on a path of awakening. He is an ordinary person with ordinary responsibilities, ordinary conflicts, and a fatigue he can no longer quite explain. A fatigue that does not come only from work, but from the feeling of always being behind in relation to his own life. For a long time, Raphael believed he needed to fix something in himself. He read, tried to understand patterns, revisited old stories, analyzed past relationships. At times it felt like progress. At others, it felt like he was just circling the same point with more sophisticated words. There was always an underlying effort, a silent attempt to get there. And that effort left him even more tired. The breaking point did not come as a spiritual revelation. It came on an ordinary day when something simple went out of control. A conversation at work that did not go as he expected. A sharp reply. A physical discomfort. And suddenly, that old sensation, anger mixed with impotence, the urge to defend himself, to explain, to prove something. But this time, something different happened. He noticed the inner movement before acting. Raphael did not think about techniques. He did not try to be better. He simply realized with an almost exhausted honesty, I don't want to carry this anymore. It was not a noble decision. It was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that does not ask for solutions but for silence. And in that moment he did something very simple, perhaps the most difficult gesture of all. He did not react. Not reacting did not mean agreeing. It did not mean swallowing it. It meant not feeding it. He let the charge pass through his body without turning it into internal discourse. He felt the tension, the discomfort, the impulse to respond, and did nothing with it. He did not clean properly. He did not follow a perfect ritual. He simply let go of the idea that he needed to resolve that moment in order to move on. Something began to change from there, but not as he expected. The problems did not disappear. People did not suddenly change. Work remained demanding. What changed was the place from which Raphael lived all of this. Life stopped being a constant test of his emotional capacity. He gradually stopped seeing himself as someone in permanent deficit. At home, this became even clearer. An old family situation, always charged with tension, happened again. The same words, the same patterns. Before, Raphael would already enter armed. Now, something in him was different. He listened, not passively but without that urgency to defend himself. He set a simple boundary without a long explanation, without emotional justification. And for the first time, he left that conversation without needing to recover afterward. There was no euphoria. There was normality. And that normality was deeply liberating. Over time, Raphael began to notice that life was dialoguing with him in a different way. Not because he was manifesting something, but because he was no longer at war. When a conflict arose, he asked less, "Why is this happening?" and more, "What do I need to release here?" Sometimes the answer came as action. Sometimes as silence. Sometimes as distance. Sometimes as presence. The most surprising realization was that he did not need to understand everything in order to be at peace. Some pains dissolved without explanation. Others remained, but without dominating him. He stopped demanding total coherence from his own story. And in doing so, something larger began to support his steps. Not a clearly defined external entity, but an intelligence of life that seemed to act when he did not interfere. Raphael did not become enlightened. He became available. Available to feel without drowning. Available to act without hardening. Available to make mistakes without punishing himself. And that was when he realized something essential. Life was never a problem to be solved. It was always a dialogue. A dialogue that can only be heard when inner noise diminishes, when the ego stops interrupting, when the past stops shouting louder than the present. Perhaps you see yourself in Raphael. Perhaps in parts. Perhaps only in the initial exhaustion. If so, do not turn this into another task. Do not try to apply everything. Do not try to get anywhere. Simply observe where you are still fighting unnecessarily, where you are still carrying what could already be released. Zero limits in the end is not about fixing life. It is about stopping interference where life already knows how to act. It is about cleaning enough to listen. It is about returning to inhabit your own existence without armor. And if something in you recognized this just now, do nothing with that perception. Let it do something with you.